Okay, now, if you haven't seen the last video, I encourage you to look at it now. I'm dealing with the genocide in the Bible, talking about the Amalekites, and now I'm going to turn my attention to 1 Samuel 15. And I just made the case that the Amalekites could no longer be ignored. They had been oppressing Israel for close to between 200 to 400 years. And Amalek had destroyed Israel's land. They had destroyed Israel's people, crops, cattle, hauled off their people for slaves in foreign markets. And this had been going on since Deuteronomy chapter 25. And so I've made the case that the Amalekites can no longer be ignored. And again, if you haven't seen the previous videos, I encourage you to look at them now. And now the question is what is Israel supposed to do? In face of the unreasonable, consistent, and oppressive violence against Israel, Israel was stuck with the imperative and responsibility for serious war. It was naive at best and more irresponsible for Israel to continue to ignore Amalek. To defend one's nation and family against unprovoked and destructive violence is a fundamental moral obligation, as I pointed out in the last video, and it was a moral obligation for Israel to defend themselves. And again, as I stated in the last video, I hope it is clear by now that it is not a simple act of territorial aggression on the part of ancient Israel. This was a defensive military campaign. Now I want to take a quick look at 1 Samuel 15, and I'm only going to read the first 8 verses because I think that's what's important for this video series. If you want, you can read the rest of the chapter on your own. 1 Samuel 15:1 says, "Now Samuel also said to Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint thee king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I remember which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man, woman, infant, suckling, ox, sheep, camel, and ass." And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them, and 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said to the Canaanites, "Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt." So the Canaanites departed the Amalekites, and Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah through Cummins to Shur, and that is all over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Now, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen, and the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good, and he would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse he destroyed utterly. Okay, so and the rest of the chapter is about how Saul basically didn't do everything that Samuel had commanded, or that God had commanded Saul, and you can read that on your own. Okay, so the question pops up here: If the Amalekites' aggression virtually required the elimination of the warrior class, what practical options for survival remain for the women and the kids? Okay, so I mean, 1 Samuel tells Saul to wipe them out. Okay, now before I explore the passage, I want to look at some possible options that Saul would have had, or what we are faced clearly with the problem that I pointed out earlier, and that is of the widows and the orphans in the desert. Now this, as pointed out earlier, a situation in which the Amalekite warriors put their families in, not the Israelites per se. So what options would Israel have had concerning the orphan Amalekite families once the warriors had been eliminated in battle? There are only 4 options to consider. Number 1, take them back as slaves. Number 2, take them back and turn them over to some social relief programs or processes in Israel. Leave them there in the desert to face their own fate, option 3, or option 4, kill them in the desert. Now, option 1, take them back as slaves or to be sold as slaves. This, of course, is what some other nations would have done, and in fact, this is what many nations would have initiated the conflict to begin with. Before I entertain any comments or questions about slavery, I have an entire video series on slavery in the Old Testament, and I encourage you to look at that before you ask me any questions on that. Now, the Amalekites themselves would have been involved in and raids just to produce slaves for resale in the slave trade. In fact, quoting from the daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most valuable spoils of battle was the people. Some tablets recorded long lists of women and children. Sometimes women and children were included as a part of the general massacre, but usually they became slaves. Now, if Israel had done this, first of all, most importantly, this would have been against God's strong slavery laws for Israel. This would have been against the law of Moses to begin with, the law forbid them from making slaves or engaging in the slave trade or turning over runaway slaves, etc. And also, it was practically impossible at this time for the country or the people of Israel. The fact of the matter is they would not have had the resources to assimilate a whole group or big group of new people, all of whom would have needed food, clothing at a difficult period in Israel's history. At the time of this attack, Israel was still engaged in Philistine warfare and the Transjordanian aggression. Had to deal with the Transjordanian aggression. At a practical level, actual ancient slave societies have taught us adult slaves generated by foreign wars often harbored revenge and would wait at night to kill their slave owners. The effects on societies of these types of internal hostile elements are well known and documented. It might also explain why Pharaoh suppressed the Israelites so abusively in Egypt as you got closer to the Exodus. So, purely practical consideration. This is a purely practical consideration, but one that has to be considered in understanding why this option was not open to Israel as a nation. In an earlier time when Israel was united and strong, and before the population decimation fragmentation under the judges, we do have a situation in which about 32,000 female children are spared and brought into Israel in the conflict with Moab and the Midianites rather. All unmarried female children were spared, brought into the nation, and distributed throughout Israel. I'm going to cover this in some later videos dealing with Numbers 31. Since the normal age for marrying and therefore losing one's virginity in the ancient world was around 12, this would mean the girls were probably around ages 5 to 6. And since they were actually replacing 24,000 adult Israelite males who died in the event, the resource consumption would have balanced out. And remember, the miracles of the wilderness were going on at this time. So, I might also point out that God very, very rarely uses miraculous events to solve problems, and never to solve systematic, long-term infrastructure problems like warfare. There are plenty of the fact of the matter is there were plenty of want, hunger, thirst, and disease during the period of Judges, but God didn't do any miracles for his own people. There are many such situations during the monarchy and during the life of the patriarchs as well, but no miracles. When Jesus walked on the earth and performed his selected miracles, there were multitudes of people who were not healed, who died prematurely, who were abused, exploited by the Romans. The only large-scale population-wide miracles I can think of were those during the 40 years during the wilderness wanderings, which was a mere blimp in biblical history, and they were never foreshadowed during the famines of the patriarchs, nor repeated during the droughts and famines of Israel. So based on this pattern, it would be unwarranted to assume that God would have made manna appear for these people if he really cared about them. The whole position of if God really cared would intervene miraculously to stop a crime, keep Paul from being martyred, reduce cheating on tax forms, or raise anybody from the dead whenever they were killed is highly problematic and is subject to a number of systematic flaws, not the least of which are related to the problem of evil. Which this means for us is that the appeal to a miracle as a reason to keep this option one viable cannot be depended upon, and we are still stuck with the ordinary world as God created it. Unfortunately, this was simply not an option in the historical situation of the time. In today's world, it sometimes is, as in refugee work, but it is unreasonable to expect them back then to be able to do something that absolutely cannot be supported by limited infrastructure of an ancient Near Eastern society. And I'll pick up with option 2 in the next video.